For the first time since Jamal Khashoggi disappeared, the US president says he believes the Saudi journalist might be dead. Congress is turning up the heat on the White House to get tough on Saudi Arabia. So what will this mean for US-Saudi ties? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. President Donald Trump has, for the first time, acknowledged Jamal Khashoggi may have been killed inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. He's warned of severe consequences if the Saudi leadership is involved. The shift in tone comes following his Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's visit to Riyadh and Ankara earlier this week. The president's now under mounting pressure to take action. Members of the House of Representatives have sent him a letter calling for sanctions against Saudi Arabia. We'll bring in our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Mike Hanna in Washington.
It was a somber President Trump who, for the first time, publicly acknowledged the possibility that Jamal Khashoggi is dead.
It certainly looks that way to me. It's very sad. It certainly looks that way.
He says he's still waiting for the results of various investigations. But if there's evidence, there will be serious consequences for Saudi Arabia.
It'll have to be very severe. I mean, it's bad stuff, but we'll see what happens.
Trump's comments followed a meeting with his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who briefed the president on his meetings with Saudi and Turkish leaders.
There are lots of stories out there about what has happened. We just are going to allow the process to move forward, allow the facts to unfold. And as they unfold, as we make a determination for ourselves about what happened there based on the facts that are presented to us, the United States will determine what the appropriate response might be.
And significantly, straight after the meeting, it was confirmed that Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin had cancelled a trip to an investment conference in Riyadh later this month, the first tangible sign of any action against Saudi Arabia by the Trump administration. And yet another bipartisan call from Congress for the president to determine accountability and impose sanctions against those found responsible. This in a letter from more than 40 House members, which also said, additionally, we ask that you promptly disclose whether the United States intercepted communications among Saudi officials discussing plans to detain Mr. Khashoggi and advise what actions were taken to warn him of any attack. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Skype from New York, Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, and in Paris, Georges Malbruno, Middle East reporter at Le Figaro. Welcome to you all. I want to bring in with you, Kenneth, in New York. President Donald Trump has said that he thinks that Jamal Khashoggi may be dead. But there seems to be a disconnect between some members of Congress, some members of the Senate, on what they would like to do, which is sanctions against Saudi Arabia, and what the White House would like to do, which seems to be taking a conciliatory, more, some would say, sympathetic tone towards this whole affair. What's with the disconnect? Why the disconnect?
Well, I mean, Trump has made quite clear that what he really cares about is the Saudi money. You know, he wants the Saudi arms purchases from the United States to continue because that generates American jobs. So the amorality of this position is very clear. You know, it doesn't matter that the Saudi crown prince has been overseeing the bombing and starvation of countless Yemeni civilians. It doesn't matter that he's crushed civil society in Saudi Arabia. It doesn't matter now that you know, his government and very possibly him ordered the at least disappearance and very likely murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Jobs are what matter most. So that's where he starts from. At the same time, he's now kind of boxed himself in and says there will be severe punishment if it is proven. And you know, we still haven't heard the audio tape. We've had the audio tape described to us, but it's quite clear that Khashoggi went into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, didn't emerge. You know, by all accounts, he's dead. By all accounts, he's been murdered. Yes, we still need to see some of this evidence, but it all really points to Riyadh, if not to the Saudi crown prince himself, given the tight control he maintains over all security matters and the unlikelihood that anybody would have freelanced something about this stature, this visibility, without his approval and indeed probably order. So, Trump's in a bit of a bind, and he is under real pressure, not only from the Congress, but frankly from the public that is finally appalled by Saudi conduct. I wish they'd been appalled earlier.
Well, let's pick you up on that point. Human Rights Watch has long been a critic of human rights records in Saudi Arabia. You've written many reports on all of this. Here you are. You have a moment now where people are talking about human rights in Saudi Arabia. How will you take advantage of that?
Well, just yesterday, Human Rights Watch held a news conference at the UN in New York, pushing Turkey to ask UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to launch a formal investigation. We did this because we recognize that Turkish President Erdogan is reluctant to formally accuse the Saudis. That's why he's been using these leaks. So we sort of hear what's going on, but there hasn't been a formal report because the Turkish economy is in trouble, and Erdogan doesn't want Saudi economic retaliation. But what Human Rights Watch has been pushing for some time, and frankly, it didn't take the Khashoggi likely murder to get us here. We've been pushing foremost to cut off arms sales, and we've been doing that on the basis of the repeated bombing of Yemeni schools, markets, funerals, weddings, the blockade of Hodeidah port and the resulting near starvation of millions upon millions of people. That's enough in our view. Now, the Congress did, to its credit, the U.S. Congress, adopt legislation saying that these arms sales could not go forward if the U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo didn't certify that Saudi Arabia was curbing its attacks on civilians. And Pompeo, facts be damned, issued the certification immediately, so the arms sales are going forward. Now, because so many people knew Khashoggi, because it is so outrageous what seems to have happened to him, there may well be new legislation which doesn't have this opt-out, which doesn't let the Trump administration lie its way through continuing arms sales. So we're hoping that something like that will now proceed.
Let's take the view from Europe. And Georges Malbruno, you've been covering the region for a very long time. US-Saudi ties have been lockstep for 7 decades now. However, right now, what we're seeing is a resetting of the relationship to a much more personal one between the US president, his son-in-law, and the king and the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. Where does Europe take a look at all of this? Where does Europe land on this relationship that seems to be much more personal? What's Europe's view?
I think Europeans are waiting the results of the investigation. I met on Monday evening President Macron, and he was very cautious when I asked him about consequences he would take if Saudi Arabia is responsible of the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi. On Wednesday morning, President Macron asked his finance minister not to go to Riyadh to attend the next week conference. And as you noticed yesterday, France, UK and Germany decided to freeze any visit to Saudi Arabia. I think they are still waiting, but they would like to see King Salman taking a bigger role in this crisis. And I think also that they would like to see Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman marginalized a little bit after this crisis, because the relations between Crown Prince Salman, for example, and Emmanuel Macron, there is no chemistry between them. As probably I told you previously, the first meeting between the two leaders at the Riyadh airport in November 2017 was bad. A few weeks later, President Macron, and to rescue Saad Hariri, blocked in Riyadh. So they would like that this crisis could have at least one advantage, one positive, if I can say that, effect, is to see the power of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman reduced inside the architecture of the Saudi regime.
That's something quite easy for the French to be able to say. However, when it comes to Europe generally, you still have the UK, which has very close ties, historical close ties to the Saudi government, and sells them possibly as much weapons as, certainly in terms of ratio, as the Americans do. So where did the Brits fit into all of this? They are in a much more of a tighter bind when it comes to Saudi Arabia.
It's true that the British have a very important role to play, especially in the Saudi aircraft. There is a huge cooperation between London and Riyadh in this field. But we noticed also that the UK was quite tough, even before France, to react after a few days of the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi. But there is also this new rule we have to take into consideration, that if you criticize, if any foreign country criticizes Saudi Arabia, UAE or Bahrain, they have to face now global consequences. We've seen that this summer with the Canadian ambassador who has been expelled in Riyadh. So I think now the Europeans want to also to give a global, a collective answer to this crisis. Of course, it's not easy to get what they would like to get, that is a reduction of the power of Crown Prince Salman, because UK is a huge partner of Saudi Arabia, France a little bit less. President Macron was supposed to go in November in Saudi Arabia. It has been postponed. I'm not sure that he will go soon. So we have contracts and negotiations. We have diplomatic convergence against Iran, diplomatic convergence in Syria. So they have to balance. But for sure, they would like King Salman to take over the situation, and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman getting down in the hierarchy of the power in Saudi Arabia.
Let me bring in Kenneth Roth here. Reportedly, Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, has said he's told the Crown Prince, if you can get away with the murder of school children on a bus in Yemen, you can get away with the murder of a journalist. These are alleged remarks that he's made. What do you make of that? What do you make of that kind of coming from that kind of individual within the Trump administration? Surely it just emboldens the Saudis.
Well, and the other thing Jared Kushner was quoted as saying this morning is telling his father-in-law, this will just blow over, wait it out. People will forget this the way they forgot the school bus. I think where this is different, I mean, you can absolutely blame the Saudi Crown Prince for the bombing campaign in Yemen, for the repeated hitting of civilian targets, the indifference, the failure to make amends so that doesn't keep happening. But obviously it's unfair to suggest that the Saudi Crown Prince targeted the school bus. But few people believe that an operation such as the apparent murder of Jamal Khashoggi would have happened without the Crown Prince's authorization. Now, the current cover story is, oh, well, maybe he just authorized an abduction and this went awry, but that's not much of a defense, since it's easy to imagine an abduction turning into a murder if there's any resistance. So I think that what we see from Jared Kushner is complete amorality, that he just doesn't care about any of this stuff. And that, frankly, is where Trump comes from too. It's all business, it's all money. But Trump at least is attuned in a way that his son-in-law appears not to be to public opinion. And there is genuine public outrage here. Let
me bring in Galip Dalay from London here. He's a visiting scholar at the University of Oxford, research director at the Al-Sharq Forum, and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. Welcome to the show. You've heard our other guests talk about the European reaction, the US reaction, but Saudi Arabia is one of the US's key allies when it comes to sanctions against Iran. It's a key part of the strategy when it comes to Iran. What kind of impact will the Khashoggi affair have on that strategy, sanctions against Iran? And will it have, and what are the Iranians thinking right now?
Well, I think Iranians should be very happy in the first place, because right now, one of the things that has been increasing Iran's regional role is particularly its competitors' blunders, its competitors' mistakes, its competitors' crimes. In a sense, that has been one of the major assets of Iran. And one of them is obviously Saudi Arabia. I mean, if you are Iran, look at how Saudi Arabia has been a great asset for your regional role. You have the Crown Prince, who has a completely criminal war in Yemen that is causing a massive humanitarian disaster. And that gives you a very significant leverage over a very significant portion of the Yemeni society and gives you influence in Yemen. And then you have Saudi Arabia, who is putting a blockade over Qatar. And as a result of it, what Qatar does is getting a bit more closer to Iran. Once again, you have a major geopolitical victory even without doing anything. And right now, look what they did with Jamal Khashoggi, killing a journalist in a diplomatic mission in Turkey. If there was any prospect of Turkey-Saudi rapprochement, because Turkey up until now has tried to make a distinction between its more explicit criticism of United Arab Emirates, whereas not that explicit criticism of Saudi Arabia, because it wants to keep some modus vivendi with Saudi Arabia normally. But now Turkey simply will not be able to do the way that it did before, and this is another major win for Iran. So I have hard time to understand the logic in Washington if they want to let's say confine Iran in the regional politics. Actually, the Saudi Arabia is not the best bet to go with. I mean,
I'm just going to bring in Kenneth Roth here. I understand we have to lose you as a guest shortly, but I just want to ask you very quickly. You heard our guest from London talk about Iran and Turkey. Again, from a human rights perspective, you've been very critical. Human Rights Watch has been very critical of both of those countries when it comes to human rights. Is there an opportunity here to pressure both of those countries and the US and Saudi Arabia and push them on human rights in the wake of this case? Is there something of an opportunity here for somebody like you?
I mean, absolutely. I was just in Ankara a couple of weeks ago. And, on the one hand, Turkey is trying to play a positive role, say in Syria by blocking a potential bloodbath in Idlib province led by Russian and Syrian forces there. It has played a very helpful role with refugees. Obviously, it's come to the forefront here in dripping out bits and pieces of evidence about what happened to Jamal Khashoggi. There is a certain irony here that, yes, they're standing up for this one apparently murdered journalist, but President Erdogan is imprisoning dozens upon dozens of journalists in Turkey who dare to criticize his government. There is a contradiction here. This is an opportunity to push him to be a bit more consistent. Similarly, Trump suddenly is talking about human rights, say in China, their detention of upwards of 1 million Uyghur Muslims. Very appropriate for him to talk about that. He doesn't have much credibility, though, if he closes his eyes to very serious human rights abuses by his ally, Saudi Arabia. So, Human Rights Watch is always pushing for more principled stands on human rights. Governments have their reason to pick and choose, but they don't have credibility when they pick and choose. And sometimes governments decide that credibility matters. And this is an opportunity, I think, to push a number of the actors in the region to improve their record. Similarly to Saudi Arabia, if they want to redeem themselves, it's not going to be enough to come clean around Khashoggi. They've got to address Yemen. They've got to address the horror they've visited upon the civilians of that country. So this is, a moment of opportunity. People are focusing on these issues, and we want to push as hard as we can to try to get improvements across the board.
Let me bring in Galip Dalay here from London. Why has the Turkish strategy been this slow drip feed of leaks to the media? Why not just come straight out with the evidence at the beginning and put pressure on the Crown Prince and the King to do something about it? Why this slow drip of leaks?
I think there are three factors. One of them, particularly at the outset, because for quite some time, Turkey was not authorized to enter the consulate and to enter the consular house. And what I see one of the strategy for Turkey was first to provide the legal basis and then to come with the political basis. Because if from the start Turkey has adopted a very strong political language, the Saudi will say, well, without having any serious evidences, you are politicizing the issue. Secondly, I think Turkey, by basically sharing drip by drip, it is trying to kind of keep the international pressure, keep the international focus on the issue over a period of time. So therefore, the Mohammed bin Salman and others will not get away with their previous scenario, which was basically deny everything, claim no responsibility. And thirdly, I think Turkey does not want to make this as a bilateral issue between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, which it is a bilateral issue, but it's more than this. It's an international issue. And therefore, the international community's participation in this issue is essential for Turkey. The U.S., particularly the U.S., coming up with a strong stance on Saudi Arabia, particularly on the Mohammed bin Salman, because here we can make a distinction between the Saudi-U.S. relation or the Saudi-Western relation and the Mohammed bin Salman's Western relation. I mean, it's understandable that the West or that the U.S. wants to keep relation with Saudi Arabia, but it doesn't have to. The relation with Saudi Arabia does not have to be just through Mohammed bin Salman. Mohammed bin Salman, I think the West right now should make it clear that the Mohammed bin Salman is not a partner for themselves, and Mohammed bin Salman is not only bad for the regional stability, it's also bad for the Western interests as well too. So how your interests will be ensured if your partner is reckless, if your partner is very audacious, and it's not very predictable. Just look at what he did with the Lebanese
Let me bring
Prime
in
Minister.
George Malbruno here. I saw
it's-
you agreeing with some of the points Galip Dallet was making in London. Let's just talk about the wider impact of all of this when it comes to Europe. Say, for example, it's proved beyond a doubt that the Crown Prince was involved in the alleged murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Sanctions are put in place by the Americans against Saudi Arabia. What is the European response to that? Looking just ahead to the future, say that scenario happens, what does Europe do?
Yeah, it can be in Yemen, in the war against the Houthi in Yemen, where the Europeans, the UK and France, are partners with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. This war is not at all popular in UK for sure, in France also. The French government and the British government don't feel comfortable with the way with which the Saudi Arabia is driving this war. So it can be one of the aspects that France, UK and Germany can put pressure on Saudi Arabia in order to get a compromise on Yemen. After on the weapons deals, I'm not sure that there will be an immediate short-term effect, because this is business, and as you know, the relations are old. And also, as I told you, the Europeans don't think that King Salman is involved in this operation, so they want to protect the relation with Saudi Arabia, driven by King Salman, but they would
Let's bring in Kenneth Roth there, because that's a very interesting point you're making. Let's bring in Kenneth Roth here. It's business as usual. That relationship is crucial. You've mentioned it yourself. When it comes down to it, it's all about money. However, you seem to be quite confident that there's an opportunity here to push the human rights agenda. However, is that a realistic way of thinking? Surely when this amount of money is involved, human rights takes a backseat.
There are a number of things that can be done. I mean, first of all, this idea that you have to distinguish King Salman from the Crown Prince, I think that doesn't work that much, because nobody really believes that King Salman is calling the shots. And indeed, there are reports that the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, is preventing even his mother from seeing the king, to try to avoid others from influencing this very elderly man who is just not in control anymore. So, it's at this point, the focus really is the Crown Prince. Beyond cutting off arms sales, there are a number of more targeted things that can be done. If you take, for example, what just happened with Rohingya, Europe and the United States have imposed targeted sanctions on the people who are responsible. So that means, freezing personal assets. It means denying travel rights to particular people. Another thing that could be done, which would go very much after the leadership responsible for these kinds of atrocities, is to invite the International Criminal Court to examine war crimes in Yemen. That's something that the U.S., Britain, and France could push through the UN Security Council. I would be very surprised if Russia or China were to stand in the way. So these are targeted ways that would go after the individuals responsible without interrupting the full relationship, the economic relationship between Saudi Arabia and the rest of the world. So with
Thank you very much. We are running out of time. Kenneth Roth in New York, Galip Dallet in London, and Georges Malbruno in Paris. And thank you as well for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the entire team in Doha, bye for now.